When my husband's mother texted my son that he wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner this year, something inside me shattered like fine china. But what my son did next, without raising his voice or shedding a single tear, left the entire family in stunned silence. He simply pulled out his phone and showed everyone 2 years' worth of messages that changed everything. That moment is carved into my memory, sharp as a knife, quiet as a secret, and powerful enough to redraw the boundaries of our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the way the Christmas lights reflected in everyone's eyes as they leaned in to read those texts. The pine-scented candles flickering across the room, casting shadows on faces that transformed from festive to frozen in an instant. The expensive holiday table setting suddenly seemed hollow, shining silver, crystal glasses, and hand-painted china plates that couldn't mask the ugly truth beneath our family's perfect surface. I should have trusted my instincts years ago. I should have protected my son from the subtle cruelty that had been building like a slow poison. My name is Nora. I'm 39, a mother, a physical therapist, and by marriage, a member of the prestigious Sullivan family for the past 10 years. My husband, James, is genuine and down-to-earth. Everything his family pretends to be in public but rarely demonstrates in private. He's the reason I ever believed we could be accepted into their close-knit world. I met him when Elijah, my son, was just 7 years old. James fell in love with both of us, claimed we were his world from day one, and I believed him with my whole heart. The complication was his family never truly shared that sentiment. They never explicitly stated that we didn't belong, at least not until that fateful December text. But they didn't need to say it aloud. Sometimes rejection speaks clearly through silence. Sometimes it's evident in the way relatives consistently mispronounce your child's name or accidentally exclude him from cousin photos or send birthday cards 3 weeks late with gift cards to stores that don't exist in our city. Sometimes it's in the carefully angled family portraits that place your child slightly out of frame, like an afterthought rather than an essential part of the picture. That Christmas Eve gathering was supposed to be like all the others, a showcase of Sullivan family tradition at Eleanor's grand colonial home. Eleanor, James's mother, sent out the usual formal invitations on thick cream cardstock with gold foil details and a pointed note about appropriate attire. Everyone was expected to attend the annual event that she orchestrated with military precision. The evening was outlined down to the minute. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 7:30, gift exchange at 9, never a minute later or earlier. The Sullivan Christmas Eve dinner was less a celebration and more a performance, one we had been reluctantly attending for years. Elijah was now 17, thoughtful, remarkably perceptive, and growing into a young man I was fiercely proud of. That evening, he wore the burgundy sweater I'd bought him the weekend before, his dark curls neatly styled, his expression a careful mask of politeness that broke my heart because I knew how much effort it took him to maintain it. Before we left our home, he asked me a question that should have been my warning. "Mom, do you think Grandma Eleanor will ever actually want me there?" I hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't be a lie but wouldn't hurt him either. "Just be yourself," I finally said, squeezing his shoulder. "That's more than enough." He nodded, but something in his eyes told me he didn't believe me anymore. The first sign that this Christmas Eve would be different came when we pulled into Eleanor's circular driveway, lined with perfect rows of luminaries. James's sister Vanessa's car was already there, along with his brother Marcus's Range Rover and his parents' vehicles. As we approached the door with carefully wrapped gifts and a homemade cranberry tart that would inevitably be relegated to the kitchen while Eleanor's catered desserts took center stage, I noticed Elijah checking his phone, repeatedly. "Everything okay?" I asked as James rang the doorbell. "Fine," Elijah replied, sliding his phone into his pocket with unusual quickness. Later, I would understand what he'd been looking at. The text from Eleanor sent 3 hours before we arrived. Perhaps it would be best if you stayed home this year. The gathering is quite adult-focused, and frankly, tensions are high with some family matters. We can drop gifts by tomorrow. Eleanor opened the door wearing a perfectly tailored emerald, green dress, a strand of pearls, and the practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You're here," she said, her gaze sliding past Elijah as if he were invisible. She air-kissed my cheek, hugged James, and turned back into the house without acknowledging my son. James didn't notice. He never did in these first moments. Always too busy soaking in the holiday atmosphere of his childhood home to see the slights happening right beside him. We stepped into the grand foyer with its soaring ceiling and sweeping staircase decorated with garlands and white lights. Crystal and gold ornaments caught the light from the chandelier overhead, casting prismatic patterns on the marble floor. The house smelled of pine, cinnamon, and privilege, a scent I'd never been able to replicate in our much more modest home, despite years of trying to bring some of the Sullivan magic to our own celebrations. Vanessa's twin daughters, Madeline and Olivia, both Elijah's age, glanced up from their phones as we entered the living room. They wore matching cream-colored dresses and identical expressions of bored superiority. Marcus's son, Thomas, a freshman in college now, was holding court by the fireplace, regaling Eleanor and Richard, James's father, with stories from his first semester at Princeton, the same university 3 generations of Sullivan men had attended. "Nora, darling," Richard called out, raising his crystal tumbler of whiskey in greeting. Come in. James, son, tell your mother what you think of the tree this year. She used a new decorator. Cost a fortune, but worth every penny, wouldn't you say?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Christmas tree soared to the ceiling, dripping with antique ornaments and tiny white lights, not a branch out of place. It was beautiful in the same way an art installation is beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and somehow cold. Nothing like the mismatched collection of sentimental ornaments and colored lights that adorned our tree at home. "It's stunning, Mom," James said, genuine admiration in his voice. "They've outdone themselves." Eleanor beamed at the compliment, then gestured to the bar cart in the corner. "Fix yourselves a drink. Dinner will be served promptly at 7:30. She turned to organize something in the dining room, still without having directly acknowledged Elijah's presence. I watched my son drift toward the edge of the room, finding a spot on the window seat partially hidden by the massive tree. He pulled out his phone again, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen in the dimly lit corner. I wanted to go to him, to shield him somehow, but Vanessa intercepted me with a glass of white wine and commentary about my choice of dress. "Navy for Christmas Eve? That's bold." She sipped her drink, eyes traveling over my carefully chosen outfit, the nicest one I owned, purchased specifically for tonight. "I always think of red or green as proper holiday colors, don't you? Or at least something sparkly." She gestured to her own red sequined dress that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. "I thought navy was elegant," I replied, taking the wine more for something to do with my hands than because I wanted it. "Oh, it is. For a business dinner, perhaps." She smiled with teeth, but not with eyes. "The girls and I did our shopping in New York this year. There's just nothing comparable here in—" She paused, as if trying to remember the name of the city where we lived, though she'd visited numerous times. "In your area." This was standard Vanessa behavior, designed to remind me of my place in the hierarchy without being openly hostile. I nodded and excused myself, moving toward James, who was deep in conversation with his brother about some investment opportunity. Neither noticed as I slipped away toward the dining room, where Eleanor was adjusting place cards on the elaborately set table. I stopped in the doorway, counting the settings. 11 places. There were 12 of us. My heart sank as I scanned the arrangement, looking for Elijah's name among the calligraphy cards. It wasn't there. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice even. "I think you're missing a place setting." She looked up, unruffled. "No, everything is correct. I've seated the adults at the main table." She gestured to a small table set up in the corner of the room, apart from the main gathering. "Elijah can sit there. I thought he'd be more comfortable away from all the adult conversation. He's always so quiet, isn't he?" The separate table was smaller, the settings noticeably less elaborate, regular glassware instead of crystal, standard. Silverware rather than the antique silver that graced the main table. It might as well have had a sign reading, "Not one of us," hanging over it. "He's 17, not 7, I said, hearing the edge in my voice despite my efforts to remain calm. "He belongs at the table with the rest of the family." Eleanor straightened, her posture perfect as always. "Nora, dear, this is how we've always done things. Children at the secondary table. It's tradition." "Madeline and Olivia are at the main table," I pointed out, gesturing to their place cards. "They're practically adults now. Besides, they're Sullivan girls." The words hung in the air between us, the implication crystal clear. They were Sullivans. Elijah was not. I took a deep breath. "My son sits with us, or we leave. It's that simple." Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Surprise, perhaps, that I would challenge her in her own home. Then her expression hardened. "Very well. I'll have Maria add another setting." She snapped her fingers for the housekeeper, who appeared so quickly she must have been hovering nearby. "Maria, add another place at the main table." Maria nodded, and hurried to comply while Eleanor fixed me with a cold stare. "I'm only doing this because it's Christmas Eve, and I won't have scenes. But really, Nora, you must learn that certain traditions exist for a reason. Not everyone can simply decide they belong anywhere they wish." The words stung, but I held my ground. "Thank you for accommodating my son, your grandson, at the family table." I turned and walked back to the living room, my hands shaking slightly. James was still engrossed in conversation, oblivious to what had just transpired. Elijah remained in his corner, but now his cousins had moved closer, their voices low, but their expressions unmistakable in their disdain. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see Elijah's shoulders tense, his fingers gripping his phone tighter. I started toward them, but Richard called for everyone's attention to make the first toast of the evening. Crystal glasses were raised, family achievements of the past year recounted. Thomas's acceptance to Princeton featured prominently, as did Madeline and Olivia's selection for some exclusive summer program in Europe. James's recent promotion got a brief mention. Nothing about Elijah's perfect GPA or his volunteer work at the hospital or the short film he'd created that won a regional contest. In the Sullivan family highlight reel, he simply didn't exist. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. When dinner was finally announced, we moved into the dining room where Maria had added a 12th place, somewhat hastily assembled and lacking the custom place card. Elijah noticed immediately, his eyes meeting mine with a question. I gave him a slight nod, silently communicating that I'd handled it. He took the added seat between James and me, sitting straight-backed and composed. Eleanor had arranged the seating with surgical precision. Vanessa and her husband Porter sat across from us, their daughters flanking them. Marcus and his wife Diane were positioned at the other end near Richard, with Thomas beside his grandfather, clearly positioned as the golden heir. Eleanor, naturally, took the head of the table opposite Richard, overlooking her domain with satisfaction. The first course was served, a delicate butternut squash soup that probably cost more per bowl than our entire weekly grocery budget. Conversation flowed around us, excluding us with the practiced ease of long habit. Elijah remained silent, occasionally glancing at his phone beneath the table. I placed my hand on his knee briefly, trying to offer comfort, but he seemed distant, lost in thought. Midway through the main course, an elaborate crown roast with various gourmet sides. Eleanor tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. "I'd like to propose another toast," she announced, raising her wine glass. "To family, to tradition, to carrying forward the Sullivan name and all it represents." Everyone raised their glasses, even James, who smiled at his mother with genuine warmth, missing the pointed exclusion in her words. As we sipped our wine, Eleanor's gaze fell on Elijah for perhaps the first time that evening. "It's a shame, really," she said, her voice carrying that quality of projected thoughtfulness that always preceded her most cutting remarks, "that some never quite grasp the importance of family legacy. The Sullivan name dates back to the founding of this city, you know." This last part was directed at me, as if I hadn't heard the family history recounted at every gathering for the past decade. "Mother," James began, a note of warning in his voice that came too late. "I'm simply saying," Eleanor continued, setting down her wine glass with precision, "that blood matters. Heritage matters. Some things can't be manufactured or adopted. They simply are. Or they aren't." The table fell silent. Vanessa's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. Marcus looked down at his plate. Richard cleared his throat but said nothing to contradict his wife. I felt Elijah go completely still, beside me. When I glanced at him, his face was impassive, but his eyes held a clarity and determination I'd never seen before. He placed his napkin beside his plate and stood up slowly. "Elijah," I whispered, reaching for his hand, suddenly afraid of what might happen next. But my son gently moved past my touch. He looked directly at Eleanor and said, "I think we should talk about why you texted me not to come tonight." The room went perfectly silent, even the soft Christmas music playing. In the background seemed to fade away. Eleanor's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice brittle as thin ice. Without a word, Elijah pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and placed it in the center of the table. "I think everyone should see what Grandma Eleanor really thinks about family." James reached for the phone first, his expression confused. As he read the screen, his face transformed, confusion giving way to disbelief, then anger. "Mother, what is this?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. Eleanor's hand fluttered to her pearls. "It's a simple misunderstanding. The boy is taking things out of context." "The boy has a name," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "His name is Elijah." James passed the phone to Richard, who read it with narrowed eyes before passing it to Marcus. The phone made its way around the table, each family member reading. The message Eleanor had sent hours before dinner. But then something unexpected happened. Marcus's wife Diane, who had always been the quietest of the Sullivan spouses, swiped to the side on Elijah's phone. "There are more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Many more." And that's when I realized what my son had done. He hadn't just saved the single text from today. He had kept every message, every dismissive comment, every passive-aggressive remark Eleanor had ever sent him over the 2 years since he'd gotten his own phone. Messages about how he should dress differently for family photos. Suggestions that he stay home from various events because they would be boring for someone like him. Comments about his interests being unusual for a Sullivan gathering. There were dozens of them, a digital trail of purposeful exclusion, all couched in the language of concern or consideration, but devastatingly clear in their intent. You don't belong here. You never will. The faces around the table registered different reactions as they read. Vanessa's initial smirk faded to something like unease. Thomas looked genuinely shocked. Porter and Marcus exchanged uncomfortable glances. The twins stared at their grandmother with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. But it was Richard's reaction that surprised me most. The family patriarch, who had never once intervened in Eleanor's management of family dynamics, set the phone down with a heavy hand, and turned to his wife. Eleanor, explain yourself. Eleanor's composure cracked just slightly. Richard, please. It's Christmas Eve. We can discuss this another time. No, James said, his voice quiet but firm as he stood up beside Elijah. We'll discuss it now. You've been systematically excluding my son, yes, mother, my son, from this family for years. And I want to know why. Eleanor looked around the table, suddenly finding herself without allies. Her perfectly orchestrated evening was unraveling, and for once, she had no script to follow. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth, buying time. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with controlled fury. He's not a true Sullivan, she said, the words clipped and precise. He never will be. I've simply been trying to maintain certain standards, certain traditions. This family has a legacy to uphold. A legacy of what? James demanded. Cruelty? Exclusion? Is that the Sullivan tradition you're so proud of, Mother? Elijah hadn't spoken since revealing the texts. He stood straight, his expression calm, despite the storm raging around him. When he finally broke his silence, his words were measured and clear. I kept those messages because I wanted to understand what I'd done wrong, he said, looking not at Eleanor, but at James. I thought maybe if I figured it out, I could fix it. I could be good enough. He paused, his composure remarkable for someone his age. But I realized now there was nothing to fix. The problem was never me. Everything about that moment seemed suspended in time. The flickering candles, the half-eaten food growing cold on china plates, the stunned expressions on faces that had never expected to be confronted with their complicity in Eleanor's campaign of exclusion. I held my breath, waiting for the explosion, the denials, the attempts to explain away what couldn't be explained. But something different happened instead. Richard Sullivan, patriarch of the family and Eleanor's most steadfast supporter for over 40 years of marriage, pushed back his chair and stood up. The boy is right, he said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. The problem was never him. And that was the moment when everything, absolutely everything, changed. Richard's words hung in the air like frost. The problem was never him. The elegant dining room with its crystal chandelier and hand-painted china suddenly felt as quiet as a church. Eleanor's face had lost its carefully maintained composure, her mouth slightly open in disbelief at her husband's betrayal. I glanced at Elijah, who stood tall beside his stepfather, his expression not triumphant but resolute, like someone who had finally put down a burden he'd been carrying for too long. James reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it hard. I could feel him trembling slightly, though whether from anger or shock, I couldn't tell. The perfect Christmas tableau had shattered, leaving only truth in its wake. Messy, uncomfortable, necessary truth. Eleanor was the first to try to reassemble the pieces. Richard, she said, her voice tight with forced calm. You don't understand the context of those messages. I understand perfectly. Richard cut her off, something he'd rarely done in all the years I'd known him. I understand that you've been systematically making my grandson feel unwelcome in our family. He turned to Elijah, his expression softening slightly. May I? He asked, gesturing to the phone still sitting in the middle of the table. Elijah nodded, and Richard picked up the device, scrolling through the messages with deliberate care. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the occasional clink of ice settling in water glasses and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I watched Richard's face as he read, noting how the lines around his mouth deepened with each swipe of his finger. Last Thanksgiving, he read aloud suddenly, his voice filling the room. Perhaps you should stay home this year. The conversation will largely focus on Thomas's college applications, and I wouldn't want you to feel out of place. February 12th. The family portrait session is really just for the direct Sullivan line. No need for you to rearrange your schedule. March 30th. While we appreciate your interest in attending the family retreat, the activities are tailored for those who've grown up with our traditions. Maybe next year. With each message Richard read, Eleanor seemed to physically shrink, her perfect posture collapsing inward. Vanessa stared intently at her plate, while Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even the twins appeared unsettled, exchanging glances that suggested this was a side of their grandmother they'd never witnessed before. "There are dozens of these," Richard said finally, placing the phone down gently. "Dozens, Eleanor. For 2 years." He looked around the table, addressing the entire family now. "And not one of us noticed. Or if we did, we said nothing." Thomas cleared his throat. "I didn't know," he said, looking directly at Elijah for perhaps the first time that evening. "I swear, I had no idea." "None of us knew, Thomas," Marcus added quickly, too quickly perhaps. "Mother never shared these concerns with us." Vanessa remained tellingly silent, her face flushed. Porter, her husband, looked anywhere but at Elijah or me. "That's not entirely true, is it, Vanessa?" Diane spoke up, surprising everyone. Marcus's wife rarely contributed to family discussions, preferring to navigate Sullivan gatherings with quiet diplomacy. "You were there when Eleanor discussed seating arrangements for James's birthday last spring. You agreed that Elijah should be placed at the cousins' table despite being the same age as the twins." A flash of anger crossed Vanessa's face before she composed herself. "I was simply deferring to Mother's judgment about her own event," she said defensively. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" James said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We've all been deferring to Mother's judgment for so long that we stopped questioning whether that judgment was fair or even decent." Eleanor drew herself up, gathering the shreds of her dignity. "I will not be spoken to this way in my own home, at my own table." "Your table?" Richard said, eyebrows raised. "Perhaps you've forgotten whose name is on the deed to this house, Eleanor. On everything in this house, in fact." It was a low blow by any standard, but especially coming from Richard, who had never before used his financial power as a weapon against his wife. Eleanor flinched as if she'd been slapped, color draining from her face. I felt a sudden, surprising pang of sympathy for her. Not because she deserved it, she didn't, but because I recognized the fear behind her actions. The fear of losing control, of change, of watching your carefully constructed world shift under your feet. I'd felt that fear myself when James first entered our lives, wondering if I could share my son with someone new, if our little family of 2 had room to grow. The difference was that I'd embraced that change, while Eleanor had fought it with every passive-aggressive weapon in her considerable arsenal. "Perhaps," I said, breaking my silence, "we should all take a moment to—" "I'm not finished," Elijah interrupted, his voice steady. All eyes turned to him. "There's something else you should see." He reached for his phone, tapped through to another screen, and placed it back on the table. This time, I could see it was opened to a photo album. The first image showed Elijah, at age 10, holding a handmade birthday card. To Grandma Eleanor, the childish writing proclaimed in careful letters, "Happy birthday. Love, Elijah." He swiped to the next photo, himself at various Sullivan family events through the years, standing slightly apart at a summer barbecue, sitting alone at a Thanksgiving kids' table while the other, younger children clustered at the opposite end, smiling hopefully while holding a gift beside a Christmas tree. "I kept track," he said simply. "Not just of the texts, but of everything. I thought maybe if I could figure out the pattern, I could fix it. I could find a way to be accepted." My heart broke all over again. While I'd been noticing the slights, the subtle exclusions, my son had been documenting them, analyzing them, trying to solve them like a puzzle that had a solution if only he were smart enough to find it. "Eleanor," Richard said, his voice heavy, with disappointment, "what have you done?" Eleanor's hands fluttered nervously at her pearls. "I was protecting our family traditions. Our legacy. Our what?" James demanded, standing now. "Our pretensions? Our snobbery? Is that the great Sullivan legacy you've been guarding so carefully?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "You have no idea what it takes to build and maintain a family like ours. The Sullivan name means something in this city." "And what exactly does it mean now, Mother?" James asked, gesturing around the table at the stunned faces of his family. "What does the Sullivan name stand for if this is how we treat a child, how we treat my son?" The emphasis he placed on those last two words, "my son," sent a wave of gratitude through me so powerful I had to blink back tears. For years, James had navigated his role as stepfather with care, respecting the boundaries Elijah established, never pushing, always supporting. But in this moment, he claimed Elijah fully and without qualification. Eleanor must have sensed she was losing ground rapidly. She changed tactics, her expression softening into something that might have passed for remorse if you didn't look too closely. "Perhaps I've been overzealous in my concerns," she conceded, each word seeming to cost her. "But my intentions were never to hurt anyone. I only wanted what was best for the family." "And Elijah isn't family?" Richard asked pointedly. "Of course he is," Eleanor said, the lie transparent to everyone at the table. "Just different." Elijah hadn't taken his seat again. He stood beside James, the resemblance between them striking despite the absence of biological connection, the same straight shoulders, the same unwavering gaze. "Different how?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. Eleanor hesitated, trapped by her own words. The elaborate Christmas centerpiece between us, red roses and pine boughs arranged with surgical precision, suddenly seemed garish and artificial compared to the raw authenticity of this moment. "I think," Richard said, pushing his chair back, "that we've had enough conversation for one evening." He turned to Eleanor. "You and I will discuss this further in private." It was a lifeline, an opportunity for Eleanor to retreat with some remnant of dignity intact. But to my surprise, she didn't take it. "No," she said firmly. "If we're having this conversation, let's have it completely." She fixed her gaze on me for the first time that evening, her blue eyes cold as January. "The truth is, I never believed this arrangement would last. James marrying a woman with another man's child, it seemed like a phase, a midlife rebellion. I assumed he would eventually tire of playing father to someone else's son and return to the life he was meant to have." The cruelty of her words settled like ash across the table. Madeline and Olivia exchanged shocked glances. Thomas stared at his grandmother with undisguised dismay. Even Vanessa seemed taken aback by Eleanor's candor. "And when that didn't happen," Eleanor continued, seemingly unable to stop now that she'd begun, "when year after year passed and James remained stubbornly attached to this situation, I had to consider the family's long-term interests. The Sullivan reputation, our social standing." "Our social standing?" James repeated incredulously. "Mother, this isn't the 1950s. No one cares if I married a woman with a child from a previous relationship." "Everyone cares," Eleanor snapped, her composure fully cracking now. "Everyone who matters, anyway. Do you think the Harringtons didn't notice when you brought them to the club Memorial Day brunch? Or the Westfields at the charity gala last spring? People talk, James. They always talk." "Let them talk," James said with a dismissive wave. "I couldn't care less what the Harringtons or the Westfields or anyone else thinks about my family." "That's because you've never had to care." Eleanor's voice rose for the first time, her control slipping. You've benefited your entire life from the connections, the reputation, the doors that open because of the Sullivan name. A name I have spent 40 years polishing and protecting. And now you want to, what? Throw it all away for some ready-made family that doesn't understand the first thing about our world? A heavy silence followed her outburst. The truth, ugly and unvarnished, lay exposed on the table more vividly than any of the carefully plated food now growing cold around us. Elijah cleared his throat. "I understand more than you think, Grandma Eleanor," he said, the formal address, sounding almost ironic now. "I understand that you're afraid." Eleanor blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "Afraid? Don't be ridiculous. You're afraid I'm going to change things, change this family, and you're right." Elijah's voice gained strength as he continued. "I am different. I didn't grow up with country club memberships or summer homes or legacy college admissions. I don't know which fork to use for which course without checking what everyone else is doing first. I had to Google what business casual meant before my first Sullivan family brunch." A ghost of a smile flickered across James's face at this confession. "But that's not why you've been trying to push me out," Elijah continued. "It's because I remind you that the world is changing, that all the rules and traditions you've built your identity around don't matter as much as they used to. And that's scary. I get it. Change is always scary." The wisdom in my 17-year-old's words stunned me into silence. When had my son become so perceptive, so articulate in the face of rejection? When had he grown this emotional intelligence that allowed him to see past Eleanor's cruelty to the fear beneath? Eleanor's face had gone very still, her eyes wide. For a moment, just a moment, I thought Elijah had reached her, had broken through decades of calcified prejudice and pride. Then her expression hardened once more. "You don't know anything about my world," she said coldly. "You never will." "You're right," Elijah replied with unexpected gentleness. "I never will, because it doesn't exist anymore, except in your mind." The words hung in the air, devastatingly accurate. Eleanor's world, the world of rigid social hierarchies, of bloodlines and old money and exclusionary traditions, was fading, had been fading for decades. She was clinging to a vision of family that belonged in another century. Richard stood up slowly, using his napkin to dab at the corner of his mouth with the automatic manners of someone who had dined formally for 70 years. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should adjourn this conversation. It's Christmas Eve, after all." But no one moved. The spell of confrontation held us all in place, suspended in this moment of painful truth. "I want to say something," Thomas spoke up suddenly. Eleanor's golden grandson, the pride of the Sullivan family, looked directly at Elijah. "I owe you an apology. I've watched this happening for years and said nothing, done nothing." "You didn't know about the texts," Elijah pointed out. "No, but I knew about everything else. The seating arrangements, the photo sessions, the way you were never included in the cousins' outings." Thomas glanced at his father. "The way everyone pretended not to notice." Marcus had the grace to look ashamed. "Son, it's true, Dad," Thomas interrupted. "We all saw it. We just didn't want to rock the boat." He turned back to Elijah. "And that makes us complicit." It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had ever said at a Sullivan family gathering. The admission of complicity hung in the air, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Diane nodded, then Madeline, then Olivia. Even Vanessa, after a significant look from Porter, inclined her head slightly. One by one, the family members acknowledged their role in allowing Eleanor's campaign of exclusion to continue unchallenged for years. Only Eleanor herself remained unmoved, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "This is absurd," she declared, standing up. "I've only ever acted in the best interests of this family. If you can't appreciate that, Then perhaps we should end this evening now. It was meant to be her trump card, the threat of terminating the precious Sullivan Christmas Eve tradition, the unthinkable disruption of order. In years past, it would have worked. Someone, James or Richard or Marcus, would have rushed to smooth things over, to preserve the peace at any cost. But not tonight. I think that's a good idea, Richard said, rising to his feet. He looked around the table at his children and grandchildren. Nora, James, Elijah, I hope you'll join me in the library. I believe we have some family matters to discuss. He emphasized the word family in a way that made it clear who was included in that designation. The rest of you are welcome to stay or leave as you see fit. Eleanor's face drained of color. Richard, you can't possibly. I can and I am, he said with finality. And if you wish to join us, Eleanor, you will do so with an open heart and a willingness to change. Otherwise, perhaps you should retire for the evening. The ringing silence that followed this ultimatum was broken only by the soft chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, striking 9. The traditional time for the Sullivan family gift exchange. But there would be no exchange of carefully wrapped presents tonight. No exclamations over expensive tokens that no one really needed. Instead, something far more valuable was being offered. Truth, accountability, and the possibility of genuine connection. Eleanor looked around the table, searching for allies and finding none. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she stood completely alone in her own dining room, divorced from the power she'd wielded so effectively for decades. Her shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, but she quickly caught herself, squaring them again with practiced dignity. I see, she said, her voice brittle as thin ice. Well then, if you'll excuse me. With a final glance at the wreckage of her perfect Christmas dinner, she turned and walked from the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she retreated upstairs. No one tried to stop her. No one called after her. The traditional peacemaking, the reflexive smoothing over of difficult moments that had characterized Sullivan family gatherings for generations, was conspicuously absent. In its place was something new and unfamiliar, authentic emotion, uncomfortable but necessary. Shall we? Richard gestured toward the library. As we rose from the table, I caught Elijah's eye. Are you okay? I asked softly, searching his face for signs of distress. He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Yeah, he said. I think I am. And looking at him, his shoulders straight, his eyes clear, his expression peaceful despite the storm we'd just weathered, I believed him. Something had shifted inside my son, some burden lifted that he'd been carrying for too long. The burden of trying to be accepted by people who had decided, long before they knew him, that he never would be. The Sullivan family library was everything. You might expect leather-bound books lining mahogany shelves, a massive stone fireplace with a fire already crackling, deep armchairs arranged in conversational groupings. Richard went directly to a cabinet near his desk and withdrew a crystal decanter of amber liquid. I think we could all use a drink, he said, pouring generous measures of whiskey into 4 glasses. He handed one to James, one to me, hesitated, then offered the third to Elijah. If your mother approves, he added, with a questioning glance in my direction. I nodded. If ever there was a moment for a 17-year-old to have his first taste of fine whiskey, this was it. Richard raised his glass. To family, he said simply. Real family. We drank, Elijah wincing slightly at the burn, but managing not to. Cough. James put his arm around my shoulders, drawing me close against his side. For a moment, we stood in silence, processing the seismic shift that had just occurred in the family dynamic. I owe you both an apology, Richard said finally, setting his glass down on a side table. Especially you, Elijah. I've failed you as a grandfather. You didn't know about the texts, Elijah said, echoing what he'd told Thomas earlier. "No, but I knew my wife," Richard replied sadly. "I knew how she operated, how she manipulated situations to get her way. I chose to look the other way because it was easier than confronting her, and that was cowardly." James squeezed my shoulder. "We all have things to apologize for, Dad." Richard nodded, his eyes suddenly tired behind his glasses. "Yes, I suppose we do." He looked at Elijah with newfound respect. "It took a lot of courage to do what you did tonight, son. Standing up to Eleanor, to all of us, really. I'm proud of you." The simple words seemed to affect Elijah more deeply than all the drama of the evening. His eyes shone briefly before he blinked and looked down at his glass. "Thank you," he said quietly. "So what happens now?" I asked, voicing the question that hung in the air between us. Richard sighed heavily, moving to stand by the fireplace. "That depends on many things. On Eleanor, primarily. On whether she's capable of change at this point in her life." He stared into the flames, his profile etched in golden shadow. "I'm not sure she is, to be honest. Some habits of mind become too deeply ingrained over time." "And if she isn't?" James asked, his voice tight with tension. "If she continues to try to exclude Elijah, to exclude Nora?" Richard turned back to face us, his expression resolute. "Then she will find herself increasingly isolated because I won't stand for it anymore." He looked directly at Elijah. "You are my grandson. In every way that matters. It's taken me far too long to say that clearly, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Elijah nodded, accepting the apology with a maturity beyond his years. "What about the others?" he asked. "Vanessa and Marcus? The cousins?" "They'll have choices to make," Richard said simply. "As will all of us, going forward." It struck me then that this night represented not just a confrontation but a crossroads. For Elijah, for James and me, but also for the entire Sullivan family. The comfortable patterns of the past had been irrevocably disrupted. What would emerge from the wreckage remained to be seen. A soft knock at the library door interrupted our conversation. We turned to find Diane standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "May I join you?" she asked. Richard nodded, gesturing her in. She entered, followed by Thomas. Then, to my surprise, Madeline and Olivia. Marcus appeared next, looking uncomfortable but determined. Only Vanessa and Porter remained absent. And Eleanor, of course. "We've been talking," Marcus said, addressing James directly. "About tonight. About everything." "And?" James prompted when his brother fell silent. "And we're sorry," Thomas said, stepping forward. "All of us. For going along with it. For not speaking up sooner." Madeline nodded vigorously. "We should have said something years ago. It wasn't right, what Grandma was doing." "We were scared." "Of her," Olivia admitted quietly. "Everyone's always been scared of her." The simple truth hung in the air, both shocking and entirely unsurprising. Eleanor had ruled the Sullivan family through a combination of social power and carefully cultivated fear. Fear of disapproval, of exclusion, of losing one's place in the hierarchy she controlled so completely. "That stops now," Marcus said, with unexpected firmness. "Whatever happens with Mother, whatever she decides to do, things are going to be different going forward." He looked at Elijah. "Your family, nephew. And we've done a poor job of showing that. I'd like to do better if you'll give us the chance." It was, in its way, as powerful a moment as the confrontation at the dinner table, this quiet offer of reconciliation, of genuine relationship after years of polite distance. I watched my son carefully, acutely aware that this was his decision to make, not mine or James's. Elijah considered for a long moment, looking from face to face. Then he nodded slowly. "I'd like that," he said simply. The tension in the room eased perceptibly. Not everything was resolved, not by a long shot. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more moments of reckoning. Eleanor remained a formidable presence even in her absence, and the patterns established over decades wouldn't disappear overnight. But something fundamental had shifted. The wall of silence had been broken, the pretense had been stripped away. And in its place was the possibility of something authentic, messy and imperfect, but real. As the conversation continued around us, James leaned down to whisper in my ear. "Are you okay?" he asked, his breath warm against my skin. I thought about the question, really thought about it. Was I okay? After years of navigating the subtle cruelties of the Sullivan family dynamic, of watching my son try so hard to be accepted by people who had decided in advance to reject him, of maintaining my own dignity in the face of countless small humiliations. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. "I think I am." Because something had changed tonight, not just in the Sullivan family, but in me. I had watched my son stand in his truth, speak his mind with clarity and compassion, and refuse to accept less than he deserved. And in doing so, he had shown me what courage really looked like. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the half hour. 9:30 on Christmas Eve. Not the evening any of us had expected, certainly not the one Eleanor had planned with such precision. But as I looked around at the faces gathered in the firelit library, some still cautious, others openly hopeful, I realized it might be the most honest Christmas this family had ever experienced. And that, in itself, felt like a gift. We didn't return to the dining room that night. The elaborate Christmas Eve dinner, with its perfectly roasted meats and precisely arranged vegetables, remained abandoned, a testament to how drastically priorities had shifted in a single evening. Instead, Richard asked Maria to bring coffee and dessert to the library, creating an impromptu gathering space where the boundaries between family members seemed suddenly more permeable than they had been for years. As the grandfather clock struck 10, I noticed Elijah checking his phone, a small frown crossing his face. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly, moving to sit beside him on one of the leather couches. "Yeah," he said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Just, Grandma Eleanor is texting me again." My stomach tightened. "What's she saying?" Elijah hesitated, then handed me his phone. The message was brief but loaded. "I hope you're satisfied with the scene you've created. Some things are better left unsaid. We can discuss this privately tomorrow." Even now, she was attempting to isolate him, to pull him away from the group, for a private discussion where she could reassert control without witnesses. The familiar pattern was so transparent I almost laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. "May I?" I asked, indicating the phone. When Elijah nodded, I showed the message to James, who read it with narrowing eyes before passing it to Richard. The older man sighed heavily, removing his reading glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose. "Typical Eleanor," he murmured. "She's retreating to regroup, not to reflect." He looked at Elijah with newfound respect. "You don't have to respond, son, and you certainly don't have to meet with her alone." "I know," Elijah said, reclaiming his phone. To my surprise, he began typing a response. I resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, to intervene in what had become his battle to fight, not mine. When he finished, he passed the phone to me voluntarily. His reply was simple but powerful. "I'd be happy to talk tomorrow, Grandma Eleanor, but not privately. If you have something to say to me, you can say it in front of everyone. I'm done with secrets." Pride swelled in my chest, almost painful. In its intensity. My son, my bright, perceptive, resilient son, had in one evening done what I'd failed to do for years. Established clear boundaries with the Sullivan family matriarch. He hadn't raised his voice or made demands or stormed out in anger. He had simply stood in his truth and refused to be moved from it. "That's perfect," I told him, returning the phone. Across the room, Thomas was watching us with a thoughtful expression. After a moment's hesitation, he approached, perching awkwardly on the arm of a nearby chair. "Hey," he said to Elijah. "I was thinking. There's this film festival happening downtown next month. Independent shorts and documentaries. Might be cool to check out if you're interested." It was such a small thing, a casual invitation, the kind cousins might naturally extend to each other. But in this context, it felt monumental. Thomas wasn't just making conversation, he was making an effort, taking the first step toward a genuine relationship after years of Eleanor-enforced distance. Elijah seemed to recognize the significance too. "Yeah," he said, straightening slightly. "That sounds great, actually. I've been wanting to go." "Cool." Thomas nodded, looking relieved. "I'll text you the details." A simple exchange, unremarkable, in most families. But here, in this room, on this night, it represented something profound. The first tender shoots of connection growing through cracks in a wall that had seemed impenetrable only hours before. As the evening progressed, other small miracles occurred. Madeline and Olivia, initially hovering together as they always did, gradually separated. Madeline drifting toward Elijah to ask about his photography class, Olivia engaging James in a conversation about her college applications. Marcus and Diane spoke quietly with Richard in one corner, their expressions serious but not tense. Only Vanessa and Porter remained absent, having left shortly after Eleanor's retreat upstairs, muttering something about prior commitments. Around 11, Maria appeared with a subtle reminder that it was getting late. Richard thanked her and suggested we might all consider heading home as it had been quite an evening. No one disagreed with that assessment. As we gathered our coats in the grand foyer, the Christmas tree still glittering in the adjacent room, oblivious to the family earthquake that had occurred beneath its branches, Richard pulled me aside. "Nora," he said quietly, his voice pitched for my ears alone, "I want to thank you." I blinked in surprise. For what? For your patience all these years, for not giving up on this family despite having every reason to do so. His eyes, so like James's, held genuine regret. And for raising such an extraordinary young man. Elijah is a credit to you in every way. The unexpected acknowledgement brought a lump to my throat. "Thank you," I managed, unable to say more without risking tears. Richard nodded, seeming to understand. "Things will be different now," he promised. "It may take time. Old habits die hard, especially Eleanor's. But change is coming. You have my word on that." I believed him, though I also recognized the challenge ahead. Eleanor Sullivan had spent decades constructing her version of family, her hierarchy of belonging. She wouldn't relinquish that control without a fight, regardless of what had transpired tonight. As if reading my thoughts, Richard added, "Don't worry about Eleanor, I'll handle her." For the first time, I saw a glint of steel beneath his courtly exterior, a reminder that he hadn't built a business empire by being easily outmaneuvered. Eleanor might rule the social sphere of the Sullivan family, but Richard controlled the resources, a fact she seemed to have momentarily forgotten at dinner. We said our goodbyes, accepting hugs from Marcus and Diane, fist bumps between Elijah and Thomas, tentative waves from the twins. No gifts were exchanged, no traditional Sullivan family photographs taken. The carefully choreographed Christmas Eve performance had been abandoned for something messier, but infinitely more meaningful. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Christmas lights twinkled from houses along the way, ordinary families celebrating in ordinary ways, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred in our lives. It wasn't until we pulled into our driveway that James broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said simply, turning off the engine but making no move to exit the car. I shifted to face him. For what? For not seeing it clearly until tonight. For not standing up to her sooner. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. For letting her treat you both that way for so long. Hey, I said gently, placing my hand over his. You stood up when it mattered most. From the back seat, Elijah spoke up. She's right, Dad. You did good tonight. Dad. He'd been calling James by his first name for years, occasionally stepdad when introducing him to others. Never simply Dad. The shift wasn't lost on James, whose eyes widened slightly before filling with unexpected tears. Thanks, buddy, he said, his voice rough with emotion. That means a lot. We sat there for a moment longer, the three of us, connected in a way that felt new and solid. Then Elijah leaned forward between the front seats. So, are we going to sit in the car all night, or can we go inside and have some real Christmas cookies? Because no offense to Maria, but those fancy things at Grandma's house tasted like cardboard covered in gold leaf. James and I burst out laughing, the tension of the evening finally breaking. Real cookies it is, I agreed, reaching for my purse. And maybe some hot chocolate. With the mini marshmallows? Elijah asked, suddenly sounding younger than his 17 years. Is there any other kind? I replied with a smile. Inside, our modest home felt welcoming and warm after the austere grandeur of the Sullivan estate. Our Christmas tree, slightly lopsided and decorated with a mismatched collection of ornaments gathered over the years, glowed cheerfully in the corner of the living room. Wrapped presents in various shapes and sizes clustered beneath it, their paper colorful and occasionally wrinkled where the tape hadn't quite cooperated. Home sweet home, James said with a contented sigh, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. I busied myself in the kitchen, pulling out cookie ingredients while James started the hot chocolate. Elijah disappeared upstairs briefly, returning. In sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, looking far more comfortable than he had in his Christmas dinner attire. Can I help? He asked, joining me at the counter. Sure. I handed him the cookie cutters. You're in charge of shapes. We worked, together in comfortable familiarity, the rhythms of our small family reasserting themselves after the disturbance of the evening. As I rolled out the dough, I found myself reflecting on Eleanor's words at dinner. I assumed he would eventually tire of playing father to someone else's son and return to the life he was meant to have. The life he was meant to have, according to Eleanor's narrow vision, that meant marrying someone from a similar background, having biologically related children, maintaining the Sullivan bloodline and traditions without disruption. But watching James now, singing off-key Christmas carols while stirring hot chocolate, playfully flicking a marshmallow at Elijah who caught it in his mouth with practiced ease, I knew with absolute certainty that this was precisely the life he was meant to have. This messy, warm, imperfect family that had been forged through choice rather than obligation. What are you smiling about? James asked, catching my expression. Just thinking about how lucky I am, I replied honestly. He crossed the kitchen to drop a kiss on my forehead. We're the lucky ones, he corrected, glancing at Elijah who was carefully arranging star-shaped cookies on a baking sheet. Later, as we sat in the living room with our cookies and hot chocolate, the Christmas tree lights casting multicolored patterns across the walls, Elijah surprised us by raising his mug in a toast. To tonight, he said simply. James and I raised our mugs in response. To tonight, we echoed. We didn't need to elaborate. We all understood what that toast encompassed. The confrontation, the revelations, the boundaries established, the connections reformed. Most of all, the truth finally spoken aloud after years of polite pretense. Can I ask you something? Elijah said after a moment, looking at me. Why did you keep taking me to their house all these years, when you knew how they felt? It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times. I took a sip of hot chocolate, organizing my thoughts before answering. I began, then paused, wanting to be completely honest. I thought if we kept showing up, if we kept trying, eventually they'd see you for who you really are. They'd realize what they were missing by keeping you at arm's length. I shook my head, seeing now how futile that strategy had been. I thought, I was teaching you perseverance, but maybe I was just teaching you to accept being treated as less than you deserve. You weren't, Elijah said immediately. You were teaching me to be brave enough to keep showing up in hard places, and eventually, to be brave enough to stand up for myself when I needed to. His perspective startled me, the idea that he had drawn strength rather than damage from those years of subtle rejection. It hadn't occurred to me that he might view our continued engagement with the Sullivan family as an exercise in courage rather than futility. That's a generous way to look at it, I said softly. It's the true way, he insisted. Tonight wouldn't have happened if we hadn't kept showing up. I wouldn't have had all those texts to show everyone if I'd given up on them years ago. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You saved those messages for 2 years. Why didn't you tell us about them sooner? Elijah considered the question, spinning a half-eaten cookie between his fingers. At first, I thought maybe I was misinterpreting them. Like, maybe this was just how rich grandmothers talk to their grandkids. He gave a wry smile. And then later, I guess I was collecting evidence. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. Sure of what? I asked. That it wasn't in my head. That I wasn't imagining it. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. And that when I finally did say something, no one could deny it or explain it away. The strategic thinking behind his silence impressed me. While I'd been trying to shield him from the full awareness of Eleanor's rejection, he'd been methodically documenting it, preparing for the moment when the truth would need to be incontrovertible. Well, it worked, James acknowledged. No one could deny what was right in front of them on that screen. Not even Vanessa? I raised an eyebrow, thinking of James's sister who had left rather than confront her mother's behavior. Especially, not Vanessa, James said with a sigh. She's just not ready to deal with it yet, but she will be eventually. Tonight changed everything, whether she wants to admit it or not. We fell into a contemplative silence, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant chiming of our kitchen clock marking the approach of midnight, Christmas Day. Should we open one present now? James suggested, nodding toward the tree. Midnight tradition and all. It was our small family custom, one present each on Christmas Eve at midnight, the rest in the morning. A blend of my childhood tradition and one James had started when he joined our family. Definitely, Elijah agreed, setting aside his mug and moving toward the tree. He retrieved 3 packages, distributing them with ceremonial solemnity. Ladies first, he announced, handing me a small box wrapped in silver paper. I unwrapped it carefully to find a velvet jewelry case. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with 3 interlocking circles, a larger one flanked by 2 smaller ones. It's us, James explained, watching my face anxiously. The 3 of us, connected. It's perfect, I whispered, immediately, fastening it around my neck. I love it. James went next, tearing into the package Elijah had selected for him with boyish enthusiasm. Inside was a vintage record of James's favorite jazz album, one he'd been searching for at every second hand shop for years. How did you find this? He exclaimed, examining the pristine cover with reverence. Elijah shrugged, but couldn't hide his pleased smile. I have my sources. Finally, it was Elijah's turn. He opened the small package I'd handed him, revealing a key attached to a leather keychain embossed with his initials. He looked up, confused. A key? To the dark room, James explained. We converted the garden shed last weekend while you were at your photography workshop. It's all set up. Enlarger, trays, chemicals, everything you need. Elijah's eyes widened. Are you serious? My own darkroom? You've outgrown the bathroom. Set up, I said, remembering the makeshift arrangements that had taken over our only bathroom every weekend for the past year. And your work deserves a proper space. He stared at the key in his palm, then back at us with an expression of such pure joy it made my heart ache. Thank you. Really, this is amazing. Want to see it? James asked, already standing. Now? It's midnight. No better time, James insisted, grabbing his coat from the hook by the door. Christmas magic and all that. Laughing, we bundled up and trooped out to the garden shed, a small structure at the back of our modest yard that had primarily been used for storing lawn equipment until now. James flicked on the light to reveal a complete transformation. Black curtains covering the windows, a work table along one wall, a professional enlarger mounted securely, trays arranged in sequence, shelves stocked with photographic paper and chemicals. Everything a young photographer could need to develop his own work. Elijah moved through the space in silent wonder, touching each piece of equipment with reverent fingers. How did you do all this? This stuff is expensive. We had help, I admitted. Your school's photography teacher gave us advice on what to buy, and I hesitated, exchanging a glance with James. And your grandfather contributed, James finished. Richard, he wanted to do something meaningful for you. Elijah looked up sharply. Grandfather Richard knew about this? Before tonight? James nodded. He called me last month, said he wanted to do something for you for Christmas. Something real, not just another gift card or sweater you'd never wear. We talked about your photography, and he offered to help set this up. I had no idea, Elijah murmured, adjusting the height of the enlarger with careful hands. He's been noticing, I said gently. Maybe not speaking up, but noticing. The photos you've shown at family gatherings, the awards you've won. He's been paying attention, even if it wasn't obvious. Elijah absorbed this information silently, continuing his inspection of the darkroom. Finally, he turned to face us, his expression serious. Thank you, he said simply. This means everything. Back inside, warm again with fresh mugs of hot chocolate, we talked late into the night. Not just about the events at Eleanor's house, but about everything. School, photography, James's work, my patients, plans for the coming year. It was the kind of deep, meandering conversation families rarely make time for in the rush of daily life, but which forms the bedrock of genuine connection. As the clock approached 2 a.m, Elijah finally yawned and announced he was heading to bed. He hugged me, then James, holding on perhaps a bit longer than usual before disappearing upstairs. In the sudden quiet, James and I settled on the couch, my head on his shoulder, his arm around me. The Christmas tree lights continued their rhythmic blinking, casting the room in alternating patterns of color and shadow. Some Christmas Eve, James murmured, his voice soft with exhaustion. I agreed, too tired for full sentences. Do you think she'll try to contact him again? Tomorrow? I didn't need to ask who she was. Probably. But it won't work the same way anymore. He sees her clearly now. We all do. James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. I keep thinking about something Elijah said tonight, he finally ventured. About how he kept showing up in hard places. How that was bravery, not foolishness. I shifted to look up at his face, shadowed in the dim light. What about it? It made me realize something. About courage. His voice was thoughtful, measured. I always thought courage was about grand gestures, standing up dramatically, making speeches, walking out when things got bad. But maybe real courage is more about consistency, about showing up over and over in difficult spaces, even when it would be easier to stay away. The insight resonated deeply. Like you did all those years with your family, I pointed out. Even when they made it clear they didn't fully accept me or Elijah, you kept bringing us back, kept trying to build bridges. He shook his head slightly. I wasn't brave enough. I didn't confront the problem directly. Because you were trying to protect us, I countered. You thought keeping the peace was the best way to shield us from hurt. That was its own kind of courage, James. He considered this, seemingly unconvinced. Maybe. But Elijah's courage was clearer, more honest. He's had different lessons than we had, I said softly. He grew up watching us navigate hard situations with as much grace as we could manage. He learned from that, from our successes and our failures. And tonight, he took all those lessons and showed us something new about standing in your truth, without apology. James smiled, a hint of wonder in his expression. When did our kid get so wise? When we weren't looking, I replied with a small laugh. That's usually how it happens. We fell silent again, content to simply be together in the aftermath of such an emotionally charged evening. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting our small front yard with white. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a warm, golden glow. "Merry Christmas," James whispered, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Merry Christmas," I echoed, my eyes already drifting closed. As I balanced on the edge of sleep, a thought surfaced with unexpected clarity. Eleanor had been wrong about so many things, but perhaps most fundamentally, she had been wrong about the nature of family itself. She believed family was about bloodlines and traditions, about maintaining appearances and hierarchies of belonging. But tonight had proven otherwise. Family, real family, was about seeing each other clearly, speaking truth even when it was difficult, making space for growth and change and honest connection. It was about choosing each other, day after day, even when that choice came with complications. And as I finally surrendered to sleep, wrapped in the warmth of James's embrace with our son sleeping peacefully upstairs, I knew with absolute certainty that we had the only kind of family that truly mattered, one built on love, truth, and the courage to stand up for both. I awoke the next morning to the soft buzzing of my phone on the bedside table. James and I had eventually made our way upstairs, falling into bed just before 3 a.m. Now, with pale winter sunlight filtering through the curtains, I squinted at the clock. 9:17 a.m., Christmas morning. The buzzing continued insistently. I reached for the phone, careful not to wake James, who was still deeply asleep beside me. The screen showed multiple text notifications, all from Richard Sullivan. Fully awake now, I sat up, opening the first message with apprehension. What new family drama had unfolded overnight? But Richard's text was unexpectedly positive. "Merry Christmas to you all. I've had a long talk with Eleanor. Things are changing. Don't worry about the presents under our tree. We'll bring them by later today, if that's all right with you. Around 4 p.m., just me and Eleanor. We have some fences to mend." I stared at the message in disbelief. Eleanor? Coming to our house? In the 10 years I'd been with James, his mother had visited our home exactly twice. Once when we first moved in, a brief, evaluative appearance that resulted in several unsolicited suggestions about improving the property. And once when James had been briefly hospitalized and she needed to drop off some papers. The idea that she would voluntarily cross our threshold on Christmas Day seemed almost inconceivable. The second message offered a bit more context. Eleanor has agreed to counseling, family therapy. All of us, including the cousins. It's long, overdue. Your son's courage last night made this possible. Please thank him for us. I read the words 3 times, trying to absorb their implication. Eleanor Sullivan, proud, proper, perfectionist Eleanor, had agreed to therapy? To sit in a room with a stranger and discuss her feelings, her prejudices, her controlling behavior. It seemed as unlikely as snow in July. Yet Richard wasn't a man given to exaggeration or false promises. If he said Eleanor had agreed to counseling, then somehow, remarkably, she had. The third message was briefer. One more thing. The darkroom. I hope Elijah is pleased with it. I've enrolled him in the summer photography workshop at Westfield Arts Academy, the one Thomas attended last year. Full scholarship. His talent deserves development. Details to follow. No need to mention this today. Let him enjoy his Christmas first. I set the phone down slowly, processing these unexpected developments. Something profound had shifted in the Sullivan family dynamic, something that couldn't be attributed solely to Elijah's revelation of the texts, powerful though that moment had been. Richard must have had his own reckoning with Eleanor after we left, a confrontation decades in the making, and somehow, against all odds, she had conceded to change. Whether that change would be superficial and temporary or deep and lasting remained to be seen. But the mere acknowledgement that change was necessary represented a seismic shift in the family system. "Everything okay?" James murmured beside me, his voice thick with sleep. I showed him the texts, watching his face as he read them, witnessing the same progression of disbelief, hope, and cautious optimism I had just experienced. "Wow," he said finally, setting the phone down. "I didn't expect that." "Me neither." I nestled back against the pillows, considering the implications. "Do you think she's serious? About the therapy? About making amends?" James thought for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think she doesn't have much choice. Dad's clearly drawn a line in the sand, and Eleanor Sullivan may be proud, but she's also practical. She knows which side her bread is buttered on." The assessment was blunt but likely accurate. Eleanor's social standing, her lifestyle, her entire identity was tied to her position as Richard Sullivan's wife and the matriarch of his family. If maintaining that position now required therapy and a more inclusive attitude toward her step-grandson, she would adapt, however reluctantly. "The question is what we do now," I said, "about their visit this afternoon." James sat up, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. "We let them come," he said simply. "We open the door and we give them a chance. One chance," he added, his tone firming. "If she says or does anything at all, to make Elijah feel unwelcome or less than, they leave, immediately." I nodded, agreeing with the boundary. "Should we tell Elijah they're coming? Give him the choice whether to be here?" "Absolutely," James said without hesitation. "This has to be his decision. If he doesn't want to see her today, we respect that. We can tell Richard they need to reschedule." The sound of movement from the hallway caught our attention. Elijah was awake. James and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us. "Merry Christmas," Elijah called, knocking once on our bedroom door before pushing it open. He stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, looking younger than his 17 years in flannel pajama pants and an old t-shirt. "Are you guys ever getting up? Because I've been waiting very patiently to open presents, and my patience is running out." I laughed, memory flashing to similar Christmas morning scenes from years past. Elijah at 7, at 10, at 13, always eager for the magic of the day. Some things never changed, regardless of family drama or adolescent milestones. We're up," James assured him, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Just give us 5 minutes to brush our teeth and start the coffee." 3 minutes, Elijah countered with a grin. "There are presents at stake here. 4 minutes and I'll make the special Christmas morning hot chocolate with the extra whipped cream," I offered. "Deal," he agreed, disappearing back down the hallway with the boundless energy of youth. James turned to me, his expression sobering slightly. "We'll tell him after presents," he decided. "Let him enjoy the morning first." I nodded, reaching for my robe. Agreed. Christmas first, Sullivan family complications second. And as we prepared to join our son downstairs for our own small family Christmas, a celebration that had nothing to do with social standing or bloodlines or carefully maintained appearances, I felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly overwhelmed me. Because regardless of what happened with Eleanor and Richard this afternoon, regardless of whether family therapy produced lasting change or merely temporary compliance, we had already received the greatest gift possible, the truth, spoken clearly, at last, and the freedom that came with it. Elijah no longer had to pretend he didn't notice the slights, didn't feel the rejection. James no longer had to navigate the impossible territory between loyalty to his parents and protection of his chosen family. And I no longer had to smile through gritted teeth while watching my son being systematically made to feel less than. The truth had set us all free. And that, more than any wrapped present under any tree, was the real miracle of this Christmas. Christmas morning unfolded in a haze of torn wrapping paper, exclamations of surprise, and the comforting rituals that defined our small family. Elijah was delighted with his new camera lens and photography books. James beamed over the vintage watch I'd tracked down from his favorite era. I treasured the handmade photo album Elijah had created, filled with moments from our life together that I hadn't even realized he'd captured. Quiet Sunday mornings reading on the porch, James and me dancing in the kitchen when we thought no one was watching, the three of us hiking last summer, faces turned toward the sun. It wasn't until we were sitting amid the cheerful debris of Christmas morning, sipping fresh coffee and nibbling on cinnamon rolls, that James and I exchanged the look that signaled it was time. So, James began carefully, setting down his mug. There's something we need to discuss. Elijah's expression immediately grew wary. Is something wrong? No, I assured him quickly. Nothing's wrong, but we did get a text from your grandfather this morning. Richard? Elijah clarified. His interest piqued. I nodded, pulling out my phone to show him the messages. He and Eleanor want to come by this afternoon, around 4. Elijah read through the texts, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief to something more complex. Family therapy? He murmured, looking up at us. Grandma Eleanor agreed to family therapy? Apparently, James confirmed. My father can be very persuasive when he wants to be. And they want to come here? Today? Elijah seemed to be processing this information piece by piece, testing each fragment for believability. Yes, I said gently, but that's entirely up to you, honey. If you're not ready to see them, especially Eleanor today, that's completely fine. We can tell them another time would be better. Elijah set the phone down on the coffee table, his expression thoughtful. Do you think she's serious? He asked, echoing the question I'd posed to James earlier. About making amends, about therapy, about changing? James and I exchanged glances. I think, James said carefully, that she's serious about trying to repair her relationship with Richard. Whether that translates into genuine change toward you remains to be seen. But, I added, the fact that she's willing to come here, to our home, is significant. She's stepping out of her comfort zone, her territory. That suggests at least some level of genuine effort. Elijah nodded slowly, considering this. He rose from his spot on the floor and moved to look out the front window, his back to us, as he gazed at the fresh snow coating our yard. For a long moment he was silent, and I resisted the urge to fill the silence with reassurances or advice. This had to be his decision, made in his own time. Finally, he turned back to face us. I want to see them, he said, his voice steady. Both of them. Are you sure? James asked. No one would blame you if you needed more time. I'm sure, Elijah confirmed. Last night was about truth, about finally saying what needed to be said. If they're ready to hear it, really hear it, then I want to give them that chance. A small smile touched his lips. Besides, I'm curious to see Grandma Eleanor in our modest home without her planned criticisms at the ready. I couldn't help but laugh, remembering Eleanor's barely concealed distaste during her previous brief visits. It'll certainly be a new experience for her. We should probably clean up a bit, James suggested, gesturing to the Christmas chaos surrounding us. Unless we want to give my mother an actual heart attack. Oh, I don't know, Elijah said with mock thoughtfulness. A cardiac event might be just the thing to really shake up those Sullivan family traditions. Elijah, I scolded, trying, and failing to keep a straight face. Too dark? He asked innocently. Definitely too dark, James confirmed, though he was smiling too. Let's aim for tidy but lived in rather than cause for medical intervention. The three of us spent the next hour in comfortable domesticity, clearing away wrapping paper, reorganizing presents, and generally preparing the house for unexpected visitors. I made a quick inventory of our refrigerator and pantry, discovering we had enough leftovers from our Christmas Eve dinner, the one we'd prepared but barely touched before heading to Eleanor's, to offer a respectable spread if needed. As the clock ticked toward 4, I noticed Elijah growing progressively quieter, his movements more deliberate as he straightened couch cushions and arranged his new books on the coffee table. The initial bravado was fading, replaced by an undercurrent of nervousness that was entirely understandable. Hey, I said softly, catching him alone in the kitchen as he rinsed a mug. You okay? He nodded, focusing intently on the task at hand. Yeah, just processing. You know you don't have to do all the work here, right? They're coming to make amends to you, not the other way around. He set the mug in the drying rack, his movements precise. I know. I just want to be prepared. For what? He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine directly. For if she can't do it. If she comes here and still can't see me as family. He swallowed hard. I think I'm okay either way now. I just want to be ready. The maturity in his words squeezed my heart. You amaze me, I told him honestly. Your resilience, your clarity, I learn from you every day. He ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise but pleased too. I learned it from you, he said quietly. Watching you all these years, how you never let anyone make you feel small, even when they tried. Before I could respond to this unexpected tribute, the doorbell rang, sending a jolt of anticipation through the house. James appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression a mixture of determination and anxiety. They're early, he noted, checking his watch. It was only 3:40. Punctuality was always Eleanor's virtue when it suited her, I replied, drying my hands on a dish towel. Ready? He nodded, then looked to Elijah. You still good with this? I'm good, Elijah confirmed, straightening his shoulders in a gesture so reminiscent of James that it made me smile despite my nerves. Together, we moved to the front door, a united front, just as we had been when leaving Eleanor's house the night before. James opened the door to reveal Richard and Eleanor standing on our modest porch, both looking somewhat out of place against the backdrop of our middle-class neighborhood. Richard, at least, appeared relaxed in casual slacks and a green sweater, his arms laden with gift bags. Eleanor stood rigidly beside him in a tailored wool coat, her posture as perfect as always, though something about her seemed diminished since last night. A certain uncertainty in her eyes that I'd never witnessed before. Merry Christmas. Richard greeted us warmly. I hope we're not intruding too much on your day. Not at all, James assured him, stepping back to allow them entry. Please, come in. They entered our home with varying degrees of comfort. Richard with the easy confidence of someone who never felt out of place anywhere. Eleanor with the careful steps of a person entering unfamiliar territory. I watched her eyes scan our living room, taking in the modest furnishings, the family photos on the walls, the Christmas tree with its eclectic decorations. But the expected judgment didn't materialize on her face. Instead, there was something that looked almost like curiosity. "You have a lovely home," she said, the standard social pleasantry sounding strangely authentic coming from her. "Thank you," I replied, equally polite. "May I take your coat?" The normal rhythms of hospitality helped ease the initial awkwardness. Soon we were seated in the living room, Richard and Eleanor on the sofa, James in his favorite armchair, Elijah and I sharing the love seat. The gift bags Richard had brought sat on the coffee table between us, unopened. "I want to start," Richard said after an initial exchange of pleasantries, "by apologizing again to all of you, but especially to you, Elijah." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "What happened in our family, what we allowed to happen, was wrong, deeply wrong." Elijah nodded, accepting the apology without immediately responding. His eyes flickered to Eleanor, who sat with hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the patterned area rug beneath our feet. "Eleanor," Richard prompted gently but firmly. She looked up then, her face a complex map of emotions I'd never seen her display before. Discomfort, certainly, but also something that might have been regret. When she spoke, her voice lacked its usual crisp authority. "I owe you an apology as well," she said, addressing Elijah directly. "My behavior has been inexcusable. The text messages, the exclusion, all of it." She drew a deep breath, visibly steeling herself to continue. "I've spent much of last night and today reflecting on my actions, and I can see now how hurtful they've been." It wasn't the most effusive apology, but coming from Eleanor Sullivan, it was nothing short of extraordinary. Elijah seemed to recognize this too, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed her words. "May I ask you something?" he said after a moment. Eleanor nodded, a flash of apprehension crossing her face. "Why?" Elijah asked simply. "Why did it matter? So much that I wasn't biologically related to you? What were you so afraid would happen if you accepted me as family?" It was the most direct question he could have posed, cutting straight to the heart of the matter with the clarity that had so impressed me the night before. I held my breath, wondering if Eleanor would actually answer or retreat into her usual defenses. To my surprise, she didn't deflect. "I was raised," she began slowly, "to believe that family meant continuity, tradition, shared blood and shared history." She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt, buying time to organize her thoughts. "My own grandmother used to tell me that family legacy was sacred, that preserving it was the most important work a woman could do." "That sounds like a lot of pressure," Elijah observed quietly. Eleanor looked up, seeming startled by his perspective. Yes, I suppose it was. But it doesn't really answer my question," he pressed gently. "What were you afraid would happen if you let me in?" Eleanor glanced at Richard, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I thought," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the Sullivan name, the Sullivan traditions would be diluted, changed. That everything I'd worked so hard to build and maintain would shift under my feet." She looked directly at Elijah now. "I was afraid of becoming irrelevant in my own family." The raw honesty of the admission hung in the air between them. It wasn't a justification. Nothing could justify her treatment of a child who had done nothing wrong, but it was at least an explanation, a glimpse into the fears that had driven her behavior. "I understand fear," Elijah said after a moment. "When Mom and James first got together, I was afraid too. Afraid he'd take her away from me, or that they'd have other kids and I'd become less important. Afraid everything would change." James made a small sound of distress, and Elijah quickly added, It wasn't rational. It wasn't based on anything James did. It was just fear of change, of losing what I had. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "How did you overcome that fear?" Elijah glanced at James, a small smile touching his lips. "I got to know him. Really know him, not just the idea of a stepfather that I was afraid of. And I realized that change doesn't have to mean loss. Sometimes it means gaining something you didn't even know you needed." The simple wisdom in his words seemed to strike a chord with Eleanor. She nodded slowly, absorbing the parallel he'd drawn between his childhood fears and her adult ones. "I never gave myself the chance to know you," she acknowledged. "Not really. I decided in advance what your presence in our family would mean, and I never questioned that assumption." "It's not too late," Richard said quietly, reaching for her hand. "That's why we're here." Eleanor nodded, then reached for one of the gift bags on the coffee table. "We brought the Christmas presents we had for you at our house," she explained, passing the bag to Elijah. "But I also brought something else, something I should have given you a long time ago." From her purse, she withdrew a small velvet box. "This belonged to James's grandfather, my father-in-law. He was a photographer too, did you know that?" Elijah shook his head, clearly surprised by this information. "Not professionally," Eleanor continued. "It was his passion, his hobby. When he died, he left his camera collection to me, with instructions to pass it on to whoever in the family. Showed a genuine interest in photography." She held out the box. "I think that's you." Elijah accepted the box with careful hands, opening it to reveal an antique pocket watch. Engraved on the back was a simple camera icon and the words, "Capture. The moment." "It was his good luck charm," Eleanor explained. "He took it to every shoot, said it reminded him to be fully present, to see what was really in front of him, not just what he expected to see." Her voice softened. "I think I could have used that reminder myself." The gesture wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was deeply meaningful. A tangible acknowledgement of Elijah's place in the family legacy, an invitation to connect with a shared passion across generations. I watched my son's face as he examined the watch, noting the mixture of surprise and genuine appreciation in his expression. "Thank you," he said simply, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. "This means a lot to me." She nodded, a hint of uncertainty still in her eyes. "I have more of his equipment. Cameras, lenses, some early photographs. If you're interested, perhaps you could come by sometime and we could look through them together." The invitation hung in the air, tentative, genuine, a small bridge extended across the chasm that had separated them for so long. Elijah considered it for a moment before nodding. "I'd like that," he said. The tension in the room eased perceptibly. Not everything was resolved. How could it be after years of subtle rejection and one night of painful truth? But something had shifted. A door had opened that had previously been firmly closed. We moved into more neutral territory after that, opening the other gifts, thoughtfully chosen ones, I noted, not the impersonal gift cards Eleanor usually selected, for Elijah. Sharing coffee and Christmas cookies, engaging in the kind of ordinary conversation that forms the foundation of family relationships. At one point, Richard asked to see Elijah's photography, a request that would have seemed calculated if not for the genuine interest in his eyes. Elijah hesitated only briefly before retrieving his portfolio from his room, spreading the prints across the coffee table for his grandparents to examine. I watched Eleanor as she studied the photographs, portraits mainly, some landscapes, all bearing Elijah's distinctive style that balanced technical precision with emotional resonance. Her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine admiration as she recognized the talent evident in the work. "These are remarkable," she said, lingering over a particularly striking portrait of an elderly man, his weathered face telling a story of decades lived. You have a gift for capturing people as they truly are. That's what I love about photography, Elijah explained, animation entering his voice as he discussed his passion. Finding the truth in a moment, the reality beneath the surface. Eleanor looked up at him, something like recognition dawning in her eyes. I never really saw you, she said quietly. Not until last night. Not until you showed us the truth, beneath the surface of our family. It was as close to a genuine emotional breakthrough as I'd ever witnessed from Eleanor Sullivan. The acknowledgement that she had failed to see, truly see, her grandson, and the implicit promise to look more clearly now. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, I observed the subtle recalibration happening between them all. Richard more engaged and attentive than I'd ever seen him. James gradually relaxing the vigilant tension he'd maintained since their arrival, Elijah growing more comfortable sharing aspects of himself he'd previously kept hidden from his grandparents, and Eleanor. Eleanor was the most transformed, listening more than speaking, observing more than judging, seemingly trying to absorb this new version of family that was emerging before her eyes. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward pauses, moments, when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. Once, when discussing summer plans, Eleanor began to express doubt about whether Elijah would fit in at a family gathering before catching herself, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. As she reformulated her thought more inclusively, but these moments were fewer than I would have expected, and each time the recovery was quicker, the effort to change more evident. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in Eleanor but in the entire family system. The rigid hierarchy that had defined the Sullivans for generations was beginning to loosen, allowing space for new connections to form. Around 6 o'clock, Richard glanced at his watch and suggested they should probably head home. We've imposed on your Christmas long enough, he said, though his tone suggested he'd been enjoying himself more than imposing. It hasn't been an imposition, James assured him, and I was struck by the sincerity in his voice. This visit, awkward and imperfect though it had been, had given him something he'd never truly had before. The hope that his parents and his chosen family might someday truly integrate, that he might not always have to stand divided between two worlds. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor paused by the family photos displayed on our mantel. Her attention was caught by one in particular, a candid shot taken at the beach last summer, the three of us laughing as waves crashed around our knees, our faces alight with genuine joy. You look happy, she observed quietly. All of you, together. We are, I confirmed simply. She nodded, a hint of wistfulness in her expression. I think perhaps I've been measuring family by the wrong standards. All these years. Appearances, traditions, bloodlines. None of that matters much compared to this. She gestured to the photo. Genuine happiness. It was a profound admission from a woman who had built her entire identity around maintaining appearances and upholding traditions. I didn't point out that it had taken her a decade to reach this realization, or that her belated epiphany couldn't erase the years of hurt her grandson had endured. There would be time for those more difficult conversations. In the family therapy sessions Richard had mentioned. For now, it was enough that she was beginning to see, truly see, what had been in front of her all along. A family built on love rather than obligation, on choice rather than circumstance. At the door, goodbyes were exchanged with newfound awkwardness, none of us quite sure of the appropriate level of physical affection after such a transformative 24 hours. Richard solved the dilemma by initiating hugs all around, including a particularly long one with Elijah that spoke volumes about his regret and commitment to change. Eleanor was more reserved, offering a handshake to me that evolved into an awkward half-embrace, a more natural hug for James, and finally, a tentative approach to Elijah. I hope, she said, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain, that you might give me the chance to be a better grandmother to you. Elijah considered her. For a long moment, his expression thoughtful. I'd like that, he said finally. But it has to be real. No more pretending. No more pretending, she agreed solemnly. Only truth from now on. As their car pulled away from our curb, the three of us stood in the doorway, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The winter air was crisp against our faces. The early darkness of December settled around our neighborhood. Holiday lights twinkling from nearby houses. Well, James said into the silence, that was surreal, I suggested. Unexpected, Elijah offered. Both, James agreed with a small laugh. Definitely both. We returned to the warmth of our home, closing the door on the outside world. Once more. The living room still held traces of our visitors, coffee cups on the side tables, Elijah's portfolio spread across the coffee table, the new gifts added to our Christmas collection. Do you think she meant it? Elijah asked as we settled back into our spaces. About wanting to be a better grandmother, about family therapy, all of it? James considered the question carefully. I think, he said slowly, that she's trying, really trying, maybe for the first time, and that's significant, even if it's imperfect. How do you feel about it? I asked Elijah, watching his face, for signs of distress or confusion. He touched the antique pocket watch that now sat on the coffee table beside his photography portfolio. I feel cautiously optimistic, he decided. Not naive, not expecting miracles, but open to the possibility of something better. It was a measured, mature response, neither cynical rejection nor unguarded enthusiasm, but something balanced, in between. The wisdom of it struck me again. This remarkable young man we were raising, who somehow managed to navigate complex emotional terrain with such grace. I'm proud of you, I told him simply. So proud. For what? He asked, genuinely puzzled. I didn't do anything special. You stood in your truth, James said before I could respond. You set boundaries. You were willing to be vulnerable enough to give someone a second chance without compromising your dignity. That's pretty special in my book. Elijah ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise, but pleased too. I had good examples, he said quietly. The evening settled around us, comfortable and familiar after the emotional intensity of the day. We ordered Chinese food, our unconventional Christmas dinner tradition, and watched a movie together, laughing at all the same parts we always laughed at, finding comfort in the rhythms of our small family unit. Later, after Elijah had gone, upstairs to experiment with his new camera lens, James and I sat together on the couch, my head on his shoulder, his arm around me. What are you thinking? He asked, noting my contemplative silence. I'm thinking about family, I replied honestly, about how we define it, how we create it, how we nurture it. And I'm grateful for ours, for what we've built together, the three of us. I looked up at him, at the face I'd loved for a decade now. Whatever happens with your parents, whether Eleanor's change is lasting or temporary, whether family therapy works miracles or just inches us forward, we're solid. We always have been. He nodded, understanding what I meant. The core of our family, our love for each other, our commitment to truth and kindness, our willingness to grow and change together, had never been in question. It was the foundation that had allowed Elijah to stand up with such confidence, knowing he was secure in our love even if Eleanor's was withheld. We are solid, he agreed, pressing a kiss to my temple. And now maybe, just maybe, the circle is expanding a bit. I thought about the text messages that had started it all, Eleanor's attempts to exclude Elijah from family gatherings, her persistent reminders that he didn't quite belong. How strange that those same messages, revealed in a moment of courage, had become the catalyst for integration rather than further exclusion. "Life is full of surprises," I murmured, settling more comfortably against his side. "The best ones usually come when you're brave enough to speak your truth," he replied, his voice soft with something like wonder. "Our son taught me that." Our son. Not stepson, not Nora's son, but our son, claimed fully and without qualification. The simple phrase contained multitudes: love, respect, commitment, family in its truest sense. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, dusting our neighborhood with fresh white that would transform the ordinary landscape by morning. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of our home and the certainty of our love for each other, we had already witnessed our own kind of transformation, one that had begun with painful truth and was evolving, slowly but surely, into something like healing. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And in the end, that reality, messy, complicated, authentic, was worth more than all the polished performances and perfect family portraits in the world. Because real family isn't found in bloodlines or traditions or carefully maintained appearances. It's created through love, strengthened through truth, and sustained through the courage to stand up for both, even when, especially when, it's difficult. Elijah had taught us that. And watching him now, through the doorway as he emerged from his room with his camera in hand, eager to capture the falling snow in the glow of Christmas lights, I knew with absolute certainty that the lesson had been worth every moment of the journey. "Go," I whispered to James, nodding toward our son. "Go take pictures with him." James didn't hesitate, rising to join Elijah at the front door, grabbing his coat on the way. "Mind if I tag along?" I heard him ask. "I was hoping you would," Elijah replied, his voice warm with affection. I watched from the window as they ventured into the snowy night together, father and son with no qualifiers needed, their laughter rising like smoke in the cold air as they captured memories more valuable than any Sullivan family tradition could ever be. This moment, this love, this truth, was the family legacy that truly mattered, and it was beautiful beyond words. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.